Good evening, everyone. My name is Yvonne Phyllis. I'm the co-director of operations here at the Forge. Firstly, I'd like to profusely apologize for starting late. We had some difficulties. My job here tonight is to welcome everyone. So welcome to everyone who's here at the Forge, and welcome to everyone joining us through the live stream option. So my job here tonight is to do the welcome, to give context for why we're here tonight, and also speak a little bit about the Forge, and then at the end, I will introduce our incredible panel. So tonight, we're here for a youth and feminism in South Africa discussion. This is a discussion organized by the French Embassy in South Africa, part of the cycle of debates which they are having ahead of the Africa-France Summit to be held in France in October. The summit will not be a summit with heads of state. Instead, civil society will play a prominent role in it. It will have a focus on young voices. This is in order to deepen and renew freely, without taboos, the dialogue between African countries and France. And to help us do that tonight, before I give context, I'd like to especially welcome our panel. Our panel tonight consists of Hlonipha Mokoena, Ketumetse Fatimata Mutwatse, Roche Kester, and our moderator tonight is Maneo Rifilwe Mohale. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming, and thank you to everyone who's here tonight. So to give a bit of context to tonight and why here at the Forge we think it's important for this kind of debate to happen in our space, I am going to quote from the work of Dr. Siphokazi Magadla, who's currently the senior lecturer in the Department of Political and International Studies at the university currently known as Rhodes. And her work, among other interests, includes African feminism, gender, and citizenship. And I will quote specifically from her paper, which she had titled, "The Personal is the International, for Black girls who've considered politics when being strong isn't enough." I quote, "In reflecting my own background, it is important for me not only to think through what it means to be a scholar of international relations in this particular moment, but also to recognize that doing international relations within a Black female body is an act of transgression. Let me explain. I view doing IR in a Black female body as a disruption of the everyday order of business in my chosen discipline, which has been accused of being so thoroughly masculinized that the workings of the hierarchical gender relations are hidden. So I accept the iconic feminist invitation that the personal is the political, and take it to mean that choices are neither isolated nor exclusively the result of one's own natural inclinations, nature, talents, and choices, because individual lives are deeply embedded in, defined by, and reflective of the broader social context and the structural limitations in which they are framed. In recognition of the complicated nature of the frames which shape my ability to conceive of myself as being able to think about the international, it is critical, therefore, that I locate myself as a young Black woman." Close quote. And why we think this work is important for the Forge is because what Dr. Magadla's work encourages us to do is to think of the international in relation to ourselves as individuals, to our lives, to our lived experiences, to our privileges and challenges, and in relation to our own struggles. So thinking of international relations in this way challenges governments to understand that because foreign policy decisions have an impact on people, particularly the vulnerable and the marginalized in society, that foreign policy discussions should no longer be limited to those who hold positions of power in government, nor to summit meetings. More intentional efforts to challenge the statist, gendered, and elitist narratives on relation, the international, and relatedness are necessary and urgent. And tonight, this is what we're doing. We're bringing the discussion here at the Forge, we're bringing it to Braamfontein, and we're taking it out of the summit meeting. So I'm going to now talk a little bit about the Forge so that you can make the link between what we're doing tonight and the context. So we at the Forge, and by the Forge I mean the space we're in. This is in 87 De Korte Street, and just across the street on 14 Reserve Street, we have the Commune Bookshop, which is named after the Paris Commune, which has its 150th anniversary this year. So when I say the Forge, I mean both here on 187 De Korte Street and our wonderful bookshop on 14 Reserve Street called the Commune. So both spaces have the mandate to specifically engage progressive Pan-African ideas and to engage radical ideas more broadly and on a specifically internationalist basis. By this we mean anti-racism, feminism, anti-xenophobia, issues pertaining to sexuality, anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, and crucially to our work is the lived experiences and the struggles of working class and impoverished people. So then the spaces themselves are here to facilitate the genesis, presentation, and analysis of radical ideas from a Pan-African, socialist, feminist, and other progressive perspectives. And it's also a space for new encounters. It's also a space for the development of solidarities. So if your work relates to our broad mandate, as I've explained it, the space is available freely to people doing this kind of work. And we also do work in various kinds of ways, discussions as we're doing tonight, but also various forms of cultural work, dance, music, and also through book launches. And you can find us, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can find us on YouTube. We are The Forge on YouTube. On Facebook, we are The Commune. We are also The Forge. And on Instagram, we are The Forge, JHB, and The Commune, JHB. And now I move to the most important part, which is to introduce our incredible panel tonight. So tonight, our moderator is Manewo Refilwe-Mohale. Manewo is a South African editor, feminist, writer, and poet. Their work has appeared in various local and international publications, including Jalada, Proofrock, The Beautiful Project, The Mail and Garden, Spectrum.za, and others. They've served as a contributing editor for the New York Times and ID, among others. They were Bitch Media's first global feminism writing fellow in their inaugural 2016 class, where they wrote on race, media, sexuality, and survivorship. In 2017, they were managing director of Platform Media, where they also served as acting arts editor for the Mail and Garden for 4 editions of the Mail and Garden Friday, and later moved on to be senior media coordinator for arts and culture at Collective Media. They have been long-listed twice for the Sol Plaatje European Union Poetry Anthology Award, and their debut collection of poetry, Everything is a Deadly Flower, was published with Uhlanga Press in September 2019. In 2020, they were shortlisted for the Ingrid Jonker Poetry Prize, the youngest finalist of that year. That is our moderator for tonight.
Yes. Yes.
We also have on the panel Hlonipha Mokoena, who received her PhD from the University of Cape Town in 2005. She's currently an associate professor and researcher at WISA, or the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, at the University of Witwatersrand here in Johannesburg. Her articles have been published in Journal of Natal and Zulu History, Journal of Religion in Africa, Journal of Southern African Studies, Ufahamu, a Journal of African Studies, Interventions, International Journal of Post-Colonial Studies, Image and Text, and Critical Arts. That is Hlonipha Mokoena. And we have Itometi Fatimata Mutlwatse, who is a feminist social worker and social development practitioner with an honors degree in social work from the University of Witwatersrand. She's currently pursuing her master's degree in social development at the University of Witwatersrand. She is the founder and chairperson of Black Women Caucus, a social movement that uses feminist popular culture and education to advocate against gender-based violence and its manifestations on a micro, meso, and macro level. Feminist perspectives rooted in equity are used to develop a holistic understanding of the political, social, economic, geographical, physical, and psychological implications of gender-based violence in South Africa. Under her leadership, Black Women Caucus has grown exponentially from a university-based movement to a national movement with a continental and international footprint. Amazing. She has been recognized as a change maker by Wits University in the leadership category in 2019-2020. She is the executive director of Crisis of Care, a consulting firm that provides a range of psychosocial support services to individuals and families, organizations and companies. She has recently been recognized as part of the Million Garden 200 Young People for 2020 under the category of civil society. That is Gedumetse. And then lastly, we have Roche Kester. Roche is a poet and an activist and currently resides in Pretoria. She has joined out as the Hate Crimes Manager for Love, Not Hate advocacy program in 2019. She was co-host for an award-winning weekly community LGBTIQA radio show on Bush Radio called Crimes Manager for the Love Not for Hate advocacy program in 2019. She was co-host for an award, I'm repeating the same thing. Sorry, I'll move on to the last line. She's also formed part of the organizing team that launched the first queer festival film in 2018. As of 2017, Roche has hosted the Pride Bookcase at Cape Town Pride, a platform used to discuss queer literature. After working as a media liaison in Parliament, Roche is happy to have found a home at OUT, since fighting for human rights and justice is her passion. She strives to aid marginalized communities in whichever way possible. As a poet, she has performed on platforms like Poetry Africa, that was in 2016, the Open Book Festival, and the Franschhoek Literary Festival. She also curated and coordinated a poetry platform called Grounding Sessions between 2017 and 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, and everybody, let us welcome our panel, and I will now hand over to the moderator, Manero.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our hosts at the Forge, at the French Embassy for having us. I'm so excited for the conversation that's going to happen. I'm very, very geeked just to be in the presence of such deeply accomplished and wildly well-rounded, I would suppose, and say human beings up on the stage. I think that it's really interesting that we started off with identity, and that excerpt that was read just at the beginning for our introduction. Thank you so much for grounding us in that. I want to also kind of read a little bit of a text that might just kind of dive us in, and then I'll kind of ask a little bit of questions. It's very informal. I'm very excited to kind of break down the barrier of also stage kind of conversations and audience conversations. We're all here to kind of learn and talk and engage. So I'd like to kind of begin with an excerpt from one of my favorite African feminists, Keguro Macharia, who is a gay, queer, feminist, rabble-rouser, I would say. And this piece is from their blog, African Pleasure in 5 Movements. When we gather to co-imagine and to co-think and to co-create. We gather as a collective and to make collectives, no matter how short-term, no matter how contested. We gather to work across difference, as Audre Lorde teaches. No matter how far I stray, whether I'm thinking about sociogenesis with Frantz Fanon and Sylvia Wynter, or blackness with Fred Moten and Christina Sharp, or sexual violence with Pumla Qola and Wambui Mwangi, or the human and modernity with Alex Wahelei and Catherine McKittrick, or visuality with Nicholas Mizuoth and Neo Musangi, or state power and masculinity with Grace Musila and Kopa Nortele, or gender and sexuality with Danai Mupotza and Hortense Spillers, or difference with Audre Lorde and Stuart Hall. No matter how far I stray, I return to a few synonyms. Ordinary, banal, quotidian. Ordinary being of no special quality of interest, commonplace, unexceptional. Banal being devoid of freshness or originality, hackney or trite, and quotidian being daily, usual, ordinary, commonplace. I return to the question of how we experience the everyday, how we live in our bodies, how we live in our homes, in public spaces, as those who belong and don't belong, as those who are planted and deracinated. I return to the ways we practice living together. By practice, I mean the deliberate ways we choose to live with each other, across difference, with love and anger and conflict and care. Audre Lorde writes, "We have chosen each other and the edge of each other's battles." Introducing Sunday in Savannah, Nina Simone says, "I hope we can provide some kind of something for you this evening. We hope that we can give you something, whatever it is that you need tonight." What does feeling good have to do with feeling free and being free? How can experiencing pleasure teach us to pursue freedom? What should thinking about freedom feel like? And how do we practice freedom? I think that's the question that I want to kind of start with. And how do we think about freedom, especially in such an urgent time, in a time where we haven't been able to gather in good conscience sometimes, but we always have this deep anxiety at the back of our throats, and thinking about COVID and thinking about who we're putting at risk, constantly thinking about risk and care. So what does freedom mean to you right now in such deep, limited spaces when we think about gathering and care and co-creating together? Can you start us off, Prof?
Yeah. I'll do that.
Okay.
Well, I actually think the key word that you used in that quote is the word pleasure. Because, I mean, when you refer to someone like Nina Simone, jazz is also, while it's a sort of brainy, cerebral music, it's also meant to be pleasurable. So it's more about the pleasure of liberation. And the sense that in some ways the isolation that many of us had to live under for the last year or so has taken away that pleasure of being able to roam, whether mentally or intellectually or even physically. We haven't been able to even meet with our closest loved ones. We have had to socially distance ourselves from simply the pleasure of family, the pleasure of togetherness, the pleasure of birthday parties, of visiting grandma. I mean, these are all pleasures that we've had to take ourselves from. But also, I think the pleasure of intellectual engagement. I mean, I'm going to speak for myself and say, as an academic, I found the last year both liberating, but also very confining, because I have had no community to bounce my ideas from. I mean, obviously, Zoom meetings are there and all these kinds of things, but it's not the same as being in the same room with people, and even checking in on people means something very different when you are having to watch a screen and having to understand what the other person is feeling. Are they alone? What about their children? What about their spouse? What about their partner? Are they in danger? I mean, how do you evaluate all of those things in a Zoom meeting? So I think the other key word that goes well with liberation is the question of pleasure, and the fact that in some ways the social distancing, the context that we are in, has taken a little bit of the pleasure of actually having to experiment with freedom. And many of us have had to experiment with freedom in very confined spaces. And I think that would be my opening sort of statement. You know, that tension in some ways between pleasure and the constant search for a freer life. And the fact that we just had to pull back from many of those roamings that we may have done, either intellectually or physically.
Definitely. Would you say then that pleasure and freedom and isolation are feminist issues? And as we find ourselves now kind of so deeply isolated from community, what would a feminist then do? And what have feminists done? What have you done in this kind of schism between community and freedom, between isolation and public life?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in some ways, pleasure has always been a feminist issue, exactly because women's pleasure is almost always mentioned secondary to men's pleasure in every aspect of life. So whether it's the pleasure of an intellectual life or physical pleasure, you know, there's always that sense that a woman has to put her pleasure second to the male, or whatever the phallic symbol of the moment is. So there's that, but also, you know, there is the pleasure of just the materials that we live in. So for example, I mean, just being able to be in my office. So I consider my office to be my working sort of sacred space. You know, I love being in that space, and not being able to be in that space, and not being able to enact for me what is a pleasurable thing, like putting my feet up on my desk and reading a book or whatever it is. So those are all the things that as a woman who is an academic, I find pleasurable. And I haven't been able to do those things. And as I say, it feels like a disconnect, because you are still trying to be your best, to do your best in all the aspects of your life, but there's this portion that's just been cut out. I mean, I can remember, if I can tell you, I actually performed a little ritual to say goodbye to my office, because I was in my office on the day of the lockdown. I literally had to say goodbye to my office. I was like, goodbye books, goodbye table, I may never see you again. You know, I had to because I felt as if I didn't perform that ritual, then in my mind I would constantly be thinking about my workspace. So I literally had to perform that little ritual for myself, and say goodbye to my books and think which books I would miss. So I would be like, oh, I'm gonna miss you. You know, I'm being totally honest. I actually did it. I even took pictures so that I could be like, if I'm lying in hospital sick, this is what I want to remember, the space where I feel the freest. And I think for me, that was one of the things that was actually very important that I did before lockdown started. And I think if I hadn't done that, it would have been a very painful experience, because I'm not used to, I don't even remember a time when I didn't have books as my companions, for example. And I literally had to choose the books that had to fit into my bag. And it felt just like discrimination. Like, why have I got to choose like 10 to take home with me? And also have to think, how long will I be reading these books for? But actually, the more that I've had to do that, to perform these little rituals of sort of, it's almost the sparseness of it, if I can call it that way, or sort of having to work out what do I value actually as a feminist, as an academic, as a woman? What are my values? And I think that's what the last couple of months have been about, have crystallized those questions of what do I value? What is important to me?
Absolutely. What I'm hearing from that, and what I love about that as someone who's also deeply connected to books as community, as a grounding, as also as an antidote to isolation, is rituals around grief and loss.
Yeah.
And rituals around, because we're dealing with so much grief and loss, which is so deeply unprocessed in public life, and also deeply unprocessed in personal and private life as well, because we've never really gone through a moment like that. And like this, that we're in the middle of. I'm going to ask you the same question, about freedom, about care, about identity. So what do those things mean for you as a feminist?
I think firstly it's quite interesting how we're able to make the association between freedom and care. I'm trying to think about, I was just born into the democratic dispensation, so I don't have real struggle credentials. But I mean, when we look at the apartheid movement, the resistance movement, and I think not only in South Africa but across the globe, I don't even think there was ever an association, or at least an explicit association, between freedom and care. And COVID-19 has kind of flipped the script on everyone, right? Because it's the care sector that is kind of holding the whole world right now. As someone who's a social worker, feminist social worker, within the sector, looking at the role of care in building and developing society, and also giving us hope for an alternative society is so important. So I think, in retrospect, and, going through the moment, COVID-19 has really actually forced us to reassess. And I think we've all said this, that to some extent, COVID-19 has exposed blah, 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 blah. I don't think it's really an exposure, but I think it's an affirmation for those who have already been doing the work, right? The idea that my freedom is closely related to the ability to care and to be cared for, right? And when we speak about care, there's still this understanding that care is like it's a pity party, like it's sympathy, like, oh man, kisono. No, but care is a lot more political. The idea that I'm able to access healthcare services during the pandemic as a woman is an extension of care. The idea that, we have social relief grants and we still want, the reinstatement of the caregivers grant is an issue of care. The understanding that we want community healthcare workers to be insourced, to have full worker rights, is an issue of care. So care has become really political. It's evolved over the time, and I think the evolution of care and freedom cannot be understood outside of the evolution of the feminist movement and feminist resistance, and the shape the evolution it's taken over the past few years, right? And I think, it's a beautiful time to sit and to reflect, but also to see how do we continue finding pleasure in this care work, because care work, truth be told, is not associated with anything pleasurable, right? I mean, and this is why till today we're still mobilizing across the globe for recognition of unpaid care work, right? Because it almost feels like the capitalist system has, stripped the pleasure out of care. Right? We think about care, we're like, oh my gosh, I don't have enough money for that self-care life. We think about care, we're like, oh my gosh, it's a pandemic, hospitals are like a death scene. The only thing that we knew, if you're staying at home, you have the burden of caring for the sick, caring for the children. So pleasure is even taken away from care. But I think what is quite beautiful is that, the feminist movement continues to make these concessions and these demands that not only demand for the recognition of care as a political process, but also give us back our pleasure in care. Yeah.
Absolutely. What I'm also hearing from you is how care is fractured along gendered lines.
Of course.
That the kind of care that we see as aksono is deeply feminized.
Yeah.
Is feminized care. And that isn't necessarily compensated in any way. That's not protected. But I'm really curious, even because now you're getting into like the self-care sort of space. And I know that there's been a lot of chat around the ways in which capitalism has co-opted self-care as a radical political feminist, and I would say I am thinking around Audre Lorde specifically, like as a black lesbian tenet of caring for the self and starting for caring for the self. I'm thinking about 2015 as such a watershed moment in this country, specifically around students. And a conversation that's arisen in my communities is how a lot of the people that were marching on the streets in FMF with Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall are now deeply enmeshed in crises of care, because we haven't been able to process, we haven't been able to heal, we haven't been able really to move on, especially because the same crises that we were seeing in 2015 are still present at the moment, even worse now. And the barriers between access and the barriers to education are even higher, the walls are higher. So I know definitely you as a student activist and a university activist, how are you recovering? How are you thinking about self-care after 2015 and 2016?
Wow, hey. It's really hard to answer that question without putting on my professional hat as a social worker. But I will say this, amongst the many critiques I have of capitalism, I think one of the biggest critiques I have is how capitalism actively disregards and disqualifies the concept of community, right? I think we have turned the self-care process, which is highly political, into an individual one-man show kind of a thing. You know, like you're the pop star in your, you're the pop star in your care struggle. Like, it doesn't work like that, right? Because by disqualifying the concept of community, we are disqualifying what resistance looks like. Right? And if you think about the biggest shifts, the biggest socioeconomic and political shifts, they've all been around the concept of community. I mean, even white monopoly capital in this country is a community on its own, right? So why does it feel like we're very quick to disqualify community when it comes to, you know, issues of self-care, particularly of marginalized groups and oppressed groups, historically oppressed groups? So self-care, yes, I think it's highly political. It is needed, but I think that we must be deliberate and intentional about preserving and building communities, right? I think, you know, many times when we say communities, people, back to the pity party, shame, man, we're coming at a becha mangadi community. But we forget that community are one of the most organic forms of psychosocial support. These stock fela, you know, are an alternative economic system where black women participate freely, right? The understanding of ECD, early childhood development centers, in communities are largely organized and functioning within communities. So I think the idea of self-care should not be away from the idea of community. And I think, if anything, you know, I like how you spoke about Zoom. We're all zoomed out. And I think no matter how great the technological advances are, nothing can ever replace human interaction. And right, and I think also where we need to take the conversation further is how do we promote healthy forms of human interaction? How do we make sure that we build communities that are sustainable, that are intentional, that also see care as quite, you know, as political and as a form of resistance? I think those are really important aspects of thinking about self-care. But I mean, listen here, I'm still the girl otorekang nail polisher 5 rand ko tropong and change the color of my nails and feel so good about myself, right?
Yeah.
I'm still the girl who's going to walk down the street, listen here, catcalling of me. I've got my headsets on and I'm gonna walk down to Korte Street like I own it, right? And that is an expression of self-care, but also organizing for survival in Black Women Caucus, building Black radical feminist spaces is the care that I'm also looking at, that I'm interested in. That political work of saying we need to build these communities that are going to challenge, that are going to say, man, right? These combos are not communicating, right? And yeah, let's leave it at that for now. But care is extremely political.
Absolutely. Lots to chew on there. I'm definitely, I see the kind of ways of communication and connection even to Roche, because now we're talking about community care. I think that what capitalism has done is try to offer self-care as an antidote or an alternative for community care. And Rochelle, I know that your work with LGBT communities, and this is something that queer and trans people have known for centuries, that we're nothing without each other, and that we're nothing without the support with which we show one another in chosen families, in political families, in all kinds of families outside of biopower and outside of the state, outside of the nuclear family, outside of hetero and homo from outside of deeply I would say standardized modes of family and community. So what does community and freedom mean for you, deeply connected to the kinds of communities that you serve?
I think the first question in terms of freedom, definitely access, safety, and autonomy. And I'm kind of trying to link it to what everybody else has said. You were speaking about apartheid, and I think it rings true as it does then now, that safety, access, and autonomy means freedom, right? And I think from any marginalized person or vulnerable person in our society, those are the things that we aim to strive for. I'm just thinking in so many ways what access means to students, what it means to queer individuals, what it means to women. There are so many levels of structural violence that occur that prohibits you from fully living in your freedom. And I think safety, especially in terms of the work that I do that is predominantly dealing with hate crimes, and also, it falls under the banner to a certain degree of gender-based violence and what that means for people who identify as women, and kind of how the lack of safety takes so much away from your enjoyment of life and your pleasure of life, because you're always having to negotiate between that space of am I putting myself at risk, or do I accept that this risk exists in society, and how do you navigate between those two spaces? And then is the responsibility of the risk on you, or should it be fixed? And I also think autonomy for me, because it speaks so much to ownership of self. And I hate the term ownership in general because it's very capitalist, but like ownership of self and what that means in owning your time, owning your resources, owning your space, owning your joy, I think a lot of those things are prohibited by other factors. We were speaking about, the introduction spoke to international law and the hindrances that it puts on a person. And so I think there are so many political frameworks that kind of deter from people's safety, the access and autonomy as well. But when we speak about community, I think, the wonderful thing, I can't even say it was a wonderful thing, but I mean, the horrible thing about COVID was that it amplified a lot of the issues that LGBTIQA individuals were really dealing with, in terms of things like access, autonomy, and safety. People were cohabitating with toxic family members, and we don't have LGBTI shelters except for Cape Town. So where do they go in that situation? Where do you go if you are in a same-sex relationship and there's not an option for you? Your safety is compromised in so many ways, physically, emotionally, mentally, and then I also think in terms of autonomy, so many trans people who are on medication had no means of access to medication now. There weren't services that were available to them to then choose for themselves who to be in their homes, or choose what they would want to have, how they want to regulate their own bodies, and then I think further, just access in general. because another thing about what was aggravated was economy for queer people. A lot of them don't necessarily all work in the formal sector. A lot of them work in the informal sector. And so because of that, the lack of employment and loss of employment was also aggravated, and it was amplified. But I must say, the wonderful thing about COVID is with the networks within the space itself, I mean, we've got what people refer to these days as anchor organizations, big organizations in various provinces that coordinate specific tasks. So they'd either provide direct medical health services or advocacy services or victim support. But then there was just community on a different level where community organizations and even individuals kind of gather to ensure that there is a measure of holding for our community at large. We were, as queer people, I think we were kind of forced to create those pockets of care anyway for ourselves throughout time, because our current structures don't make provision for that. But I think in terms of what happened in COVID, we all had to show up so much more in different ways. The holding meant a different kind of thing. It meant survival for a lot of people. It meant providing resources where you can. It meant taking out of your own pocket. It meant that kind of sense of community. And we were talking about Zoom, and what was interesting is we host at my organization what we call safe spaces anyway, and it's predominantly focused on LGBTQ women, very intentionally, because access to health for queer people is very male focused, actually heterosexual focused, since we include the term men having sex with men or MSM, So it's like, the patriarchy is still getting the queer money anyway. But that's another story. So we have LGBTQ safe spaces, and what was interesting is we used to congregate in Pretoria on a Saturday. There'd be an activity attached, because I think, the fem aspect so much. It's just fun to gather and unpack whatever topic, and we do whatever. But in COVID, we couldn't do that, so I had to take it online. And it was so interesting, because then community became bigger, it was wider. We didn't just have Pretoria, we had Gauteng, we had South Africa, we even had some participants from the rest of Africa, and which was great, because in their own countries, where criminalization happens of queer bodies, they could be in this space and share openly and feel like there's no persecution, there's no need to be scared here, there's no need to justify your existence. So that was interesting in terms of those levels of freedoms, and what community did in that time to assert things like autonomy, access and safety.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is mutual aid. I remember right at the beginning of the pandemic, I was both deeply unsurprised, but also so heartened by the communities and networks of mutual aid that were happening across class, across gender, across all kinds of axes of intersection. And it was beautiful to experience that as another layer of trans and queer community, especially in the communities that I have access to. So, wow, already. So many things to draw on and so many things to think about. But I think because things are percolating and bubbling, what I'm interested in is I think with you, Roche, your work around hate crimes specifically, and we were talking about self-care and it's such, but how is it that you were able to take care of yourself while also having access to communities, while you're constantly listening to stories of violence, of harm, of interpersonal harm, in-community harm, patriarchal harm, state harm? How is it that you take care of yourself? And I know also, Ketumetse, you do work around gender-based violence as well. So I think that this can definitely be a conversation that as you kind of come in, as you think about it, but we can start with Roche and then we can kind of go back in this direction. How do you take care of yourself touching the very sore things that you touch in your work.
I mean, I'm not going to lie to anybody in this room. I am not okay at this very moment. I'm not okay because it's so deeply personal. If you are queer identifying and you have to consistently deal with such overt violence, because you're constantly asking yourself the question, am I next? You're not excluded from the people that you are helping. You are part of them. And I think for me, also, someone who identifies as a woman, it's the same thing when a woman is killed in South Africa. You have that same kind of sensation, am I next? I always have this very, like, it's an eerie feeling of, like, as much as I can offer this kind of very practical support to individuals, for myself and what that means in terms of safety is a very negotiable thing, you know. I mean, we've had 10 murders from February 12th up until now, where there are 10 queer people that have died nationally across the country. And so there's a lot of negotiating work in terms of what the practicality means, you know. So it's like when someone passes, do you put out the media statement first? Or do you speak to the family first? Do you rally for funeral money? Do you march at the court? Do you ask for the case number? You know, so those are the steps, the practical steps. But for myself, in what it means to take care, you know, beyond this very difficult period that has just been consecutive, like aggravation of an amplification of these issues. Initially, it was drinking. You know, I'd get home, the red wine is my friend. And I'm one of those people that drink and then I write drunk. It used to be one of my favorite things to do. I'm just like, let it all out. And I still do it, you know, when I'm so stuck in grief and I don't have any other option, I write mostly, but then I was like, this is not sustainable at all, because you know what the alcohol does, right? The alcohol, you ingest it, you write the shit out, you think, I breathed. You wake up the next morning and you have a hangover, or you're not all together, and you need to be, you know, for this kind of work, you need to hold yourself, you know, very on a certain kind of vibration, if I can call it that.
Absolutely.
To hold space not just for yourself but for other people.
Definitely.
And so self-care and community care for me means having that one person that I know I can debrief with anytime, at any space. So this person that's a sounding board to my issues, regardless of how grotesque I think the information is to relay, or however I think that this is maybe not as important to someone else. Consistently having a sounding board like that, and I'm in a long distance relationship with my very good friend Neil in Cape Town that we do this with, and he was my lockdown buddy. You know, we would be constantly once a day just debriefing of whatever needs to be debriefed from. The other thing that I also do is yoga. I am such a clumsy yogi. I consistently fall over. And but for me, it's the time, and it's not necessarily the movement of the yoga, but I think it's the breathing, the also expelling whatever energy that you are holding. And I think that's important, you know, because you can hold on to so many mechanisms of grief.
Definitely.
Your own, your communities, or whomever you interact with. So
Definitely.
yeah, and it's been interesting in this period, because I'm visibly falling apart in front of my very eyes, you know.
Which is not necessarily something that you are alone inside of, and I want to kind of hold space and also thank you for kind of bringing yourself into the space and also saying I'm really not okay at the moment. And I hope that we can sit with that, and we can sit inside of that, and you can feel held for now, you know. Prof, I know that you were saying that your books are part of your community and are how is it that you are coping with the kind of work that you do, even though it might necessarily be in a more academic strain? But I think that academic work also is heart work, is spirit work, is love in a sense, in a Cornell West sort of way of saying that, you know, justice is love, what love looks like in public. So how is it that you're coping at the moment?
It's a very interesting one because the most difficult part actually for me is that I'm trying to finish a book, which seems to be the absolute contradiction of what the moment that we're living in, because I'm actually trying to finish a book on African men in military and police service.
I saw that.
in the 19th century. So
Yes.
I was sitting there at home for a couple of months, not even being able to write, because it just seemed to be a contradiction of everything that was going on. I had to honor, in a very sort of bizarre way, these men's lives and say they actually do deserve to be written about. I had to find a reason to actually finish writing, and it tested me a lot. As I say, there were a couple of weeks where I just thought, I can't even face the page. So that's the one issue, and I hope that will be coming out soon. It's a very kind of, it's a photographic, a sort of biographical account of a lot of black and brown men who, through the centuries in South Africa, have worn a military uniform for whatever reason. And so that's what the book is trying to be about. And as I say, it seemed to be just like the opposite of what everyone wanted to talk about.
It's so interesting in saying that it might seem like the opposite, but I see and feel deep resonances to the moment.
Yeah.
Right now, we're moving through police brutality in an international sort of sense.
Yeah.
We're moving through issues of race and gender in that sense. We're also talking about the underreporting of police harm and police brutality on marginalized communities. We're seeing that happen in Colombia. We're seeing that happen in the United States.
Yeah.
We're seeing that happen over here. So I'm hearing that as deep feminist work for you, engaging with what I imagine as fraught political and gendered histories and writing about black and brown men in the military and in police forces.
Yeah. So I mean, that was the hardest for me. That was the hardest part. How do I continue with this work, which, as I say, just sort of seemed to twist everything that everyone was talking about, and sort of just the more that you read, because I'm also reading court transcripts, and I mean, court transcripts are written in a very particular way, and so to read, let's say, a 300-page account of a black policeman who was put on trial for treason because he refused to actually do the duty that or whatever he was asked to do, to go and shoot somebody. I mean, it's sort of like a very, you grit your teeth and you feel that like you are internalizing. So this is what I felt. I almost felt like I was internalizing a lot of the violence that I was reading about in the court transcript. So when you're doing a research project like that, where you're reading a lot of sort of what seems on the surface very official, very cold, very objective language, and then underneath it's got all of this emotion, and the person that is being addressed hardly even gets to speak. So there were several of these men who were even denied counsel even while they were on trial, and so all you hear are the voices of the accusers, but the accused never gets to speak. And then only once in a while you would get what I think Rocher is talking about, which is the minority report. The person who comes from outside and say, let me tell you what this story is actually about. It's not the way that it's described in the court transcript. It's not what the magistrate says. It's not what the witnesses are saying. This is the alternative story. And so I've sort of created this search for these minority reports where you go outside of the space of the violence, of the machination of the state and all of that, and find an alternative story to tell about these men. But talking about yoga, so my COVID sort of lockdown friend lives in San Diego, in the US, and she was going through this totally different set of emotions with George Floyd and the protests in the US. And so every couple of days we would check on each other, and it would be exactly this. So where is your yoga practice? All of this. So, I mean, it helps to have, again, I prefer the word ritual, to have these rituals. So for me, cooking is the other ritual. I mean, I was buying so much food and just cooking literally like the whole day. There were days where I'd be like, I'm not even sure how I'm going to eat all this food, but let's just cook anyway.
Yeah.
So the yoga and the cooking and sharing some of those recipes with friends. Because I'm also a vegetarian, so I haven't eaten meat in about 20 years.
Amazing.
And so loads of people ask me for recipes. So people were suddenly interested in the vegetarian lifestyle. I'd be like, yeah, welcome, I'll give them to you for free.
That's
Give them to you for free.
That's so beautiful.
So I've been practicing a lot of my vegetarian cooking, and one of the most interesting conversations actually that I had was with my mom. So if I can share that with you. So for some strange reason, at Woolworths, they had prickly pears.
Oh.
And prickly pears are the trickiest fruit because they are not, number one, they're not indigenous to South Africa. But because of the way that when you see them on the plant, they're very thorny. So my mom spent a lot of time as a cowherd in the rural area. So I call my mom and I say, what do I do with prickly pears? I've just bought a whole box.
Yeah.
And the first thing my mom says, she says, only eat one. Otherwise, you will be so constipated. Oh, no. So that is the most interesting self-care conversation I had with my mom, who was like, do not eat more than one.
Thank goodness
Because
for mothers.
we've got seeds inside, and those seeds. So in Zulu, they say, uzozutwale itshe. You'll be so constipated, you'll hold up a stone. You'll be like looking for relief. So my mom was like, that's my advice. Whatever you do, just eat one. So
Thank
I was
goodness.
online trying to find recipes, and I'm not sure what Woolworths was thinking. Literally, like in the middle of the lockdown, there were all these boxes of prickly pears at Woolworths. I was like, I have to find something to do with them. So that was one of the more interesting conversations. And my mom and I ended up going through a whole thing. What is it called in Zulu? What's the difference between the Zulu word for granadilla and the Zulu word for prickly pear? So, I mean, those are the kinds of things that I found so interesting that we ended up having these very long distance, and my mom's only like in Soweto, but it was like a long distance relationship with my own mother, because I would call her and ask her exactly these kinds of questions like, what is a prickly pear in Zulu?
I love that.
What do I do with it? Yeah.
I love that. I love that so much. I had many conversations with my mother around recipes in that same way.
Right.
So I felt that kind of kinship as well. Ketumati, I really want to ask around this kind of space that we find ourselves in politically that feels so urgent. That feels, we're hearing about femicide in a deeply sensationalist sort of sense in the media at the moment. And I've spoken to many feminists across genders, across communities, and there's been a kind of thread that's connected a lot of people in saying that we don't know what to do, especially with this kind of existential dread when you yourself are subject to the violences that you're trying to advocate against. But also I think that sometimes urgency locks us inside of our bodies and locks us inside of a kind of, I struggle to use this word, I don't like using this word sometimes, but inside of a political paralysis where it's like we don't know how to move. How do you find yourself, how do you mobilize? How do you move past that moment of paralysis, of dread, of fear? You were speaking about claiming the streets with your body and somatically in an embodied way, with your headphones on, listening to your music, saying this to the catcallers, you know. But in a broader community sense, in a feminist sense, with a caucus, how are you moving against and through urgency?
That's quite a loaded question, but I think I want to first answer the question that you had asked around, I mean, the kind of work that we do, how then you like kind of take care of yourself, you know, all of that, navigating the work. And interestingly, what I've learned is that particularly, and I'm going to use, you know, movements that have really focused around sexual or gender-based violence, you know. And I think that feminist movements have become and this is quite interesting for me to even look and see unfold, have become an alternative, like it's like a one big support group, right? What I've seen is that a lot of the women who are in feminist movements, who are doing the work around GBVF and the advocacy, the campaigning, are victims. They've got some tragic story to tell, right? And the only place they've ever felt comfortable enough to tell the story is through their activism. So our activism, our organizing, when we say we're organizing for survival as Black Women Caucus, we are also saying we are giving people a platform to speak about issues, to speak about structural, physical, sexual, political violence that they are subjected to on a daily basis. One of the biggest issues we have, and I think, you spoke about the student movement earlier on, which as a product of the student movement, I'm really proud to say is that, we were able to kind of, democratize a language around this oppression and violence we're feeling, right? So nothing is new about what we're doing, right? Absolutely nothing. Women have been organizing, vulnerable groups have been organizing themselves, right? They've known that they are, facing a myriad of violence, right? So it's a known fact. But I think being able to get the language to articulate this in mainstream discourse has been really important, and I think, I want to salute, Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, I Am 1 in 3, RU reference list, so many pivotal student movements that really force the conversation around sexual violence into mainstream media. But now coming down to the urgency, right? I do think that we lose a lot when we are always in a space of urgency, right? But I also think urgency is important, right? And the importance of urgency comes from the fact that we are living this violence, right? It's not like something that today I feel like 2% of violence, and then tomorrow I'll top it up with 5%.
It's relentless.
Yeah, and it's very pervasive. It's there, it's consistent, and it doesn't want to go away. It's very stubborn. And so we need the urgency around that to say that the issue is there, it's not moving. In fact, it's just kind of getting bigger and bigger. Like, it's like it gets these powers to say, we're going to do it worse, However, I do think that when we think about responding, right, I think for many times, and this is probably the trajectory of movement building across the globe, right? I mean, thinking about the 60s and coming right up until, 2021, is that we've almost made revolutions an instant thing, like a 2-minute noodle, right?
Yeah.
So everybody's organizing on something, who busy, man, re busy. Everybody is just doing something. And on the one end, you're like, yes, there's a level of awareness. But then when you start to critically engage that awareness, you realize that we're all still obsessed with addressing symptoms. We're so fixated with symptoms. Oh my gosh, South Africans, the world loves a tragic story. We get so fired up by some sensational, and I like how you spoke about the reporting of femicide, for example. It's so sensationalist.
Violent.
Did you hear that she was killed?
And the way
she was killed, that also speaks to a historical trauma of disregarding Black bodies, right? How we just parade death, Black death. It's just really problematic. But coming back to us addressing symptoms, we're so fixated on these symptoms. It's symptoms, and this really takes a lot from our organizing, right? Our organizing is looking at temporary solutions to permanent problems. And I think that's really unfortunate. We see this with the COVID-19. I think South Africa is a classic example of continuous temporary solutions, right? We think about the social relief grant that was implemented last year to kind of address, the unemployed group in South Africa. Our unemployment rate keeps escalating by the day, right? We have a crisis of people who are not in the economic system, right? They are literally thriving off handouts from the state. And these handouts are not even accompanied by empowerment kind of strategies, right? Refaba to the 250. and we're just like, okay, but the the pricing of bread continues to increase. We still see that we still see things like transport, the taxi, are getting higher and higher. So we are still very much fixated with the issue of like a quick fix solution to to solution finding. Like revolutions are like 2-minute noodles. We're all at that level, right? And that's because, I mean, on the one end, we are so grateful. I mean, digital activism has been great, right? It's given us, it's allowed us to amplify our voices, come up with alternative narratives outside of traditional media. But it's also made us lazy, right? It's made us want things now. Like these problems started today. The issue of inequality in South Africa is a structural, historical issue. You are not going to address income inequality ka di 350 batho. Let us be very honest and very, and very intentional, right? And so it becomes very important that our movements are deliberate about addressing the causes, right? So if we're saying that GBV is a crisis in South Africa, like many other crises, right? I think we must be able to look at the history of GBV in South Africa, right? And as a global phenomenon, what is the history behind it? It's a commodification of this body. It is the understanding that I can't own my body even if it's mine, right? It's the constant regulation of this body, that when this body acts outside of a regulation, the only way it must be reprimanded is through violence. As South Africans, we've seen that our country, quite interesting by the way, some can call it, effects of PTSD, that we come from a very violent past where the state institutionalized, violence to suppress us, yet we still see that happening, right? So we've even normalized the abnormal, right? We've normalized violence in all its manifestations. And I think that's the dilemma. What do? Do we deal with the symptoms, like quick now because we need to build momentum for our movements? Or do we deal with that really hardcore work that honestly looks like a group of people giving off their privilege?
Here, now we're getting meaty. Now we're getting stuck into it, okay? And I think that what I'm hearing is what do we do about the state? And how is it that we can hold the state accountable? Is it even possible to hold the state accountable, etc.? And I'm going to go back to you, Roche, especially around hate crimes. There's a large debate around, okay, what is it that we do? How is it that we address hate crimes? Because in this country, we have a strong reliance on the carceral system, and a carceral system which is, over hundreds of years, has shown that very certain bodies are the ones that go to prison, and then there are cycles of reproduction of violence within those prisons, and then they exit those prisons to then reproduce violence inside of the communities, and the same people that are vulnerable, the same people that are marginalized are subject to that violence even then. So now what do we do? And I remember doing a lot of advocacy around the hate crimes bill a couple of years ago, but specifically with Ranti, and that was a large conversation about how is it that we deal with the carceral, how is it, as for me as an anti-carceral feminist, how is it then that we imagine futures beyond punishment, beyond the punitive, beyond prisons? How do we think about a life beyond police? Beyond prison? So I'm very curious about how you're thinking about it in this moment, in this deeply urgent moment in which we have 10 named, but we have more. We know that there are more, so many more, who have been subject to queerphobic, transphobic violence. And under this very legal terminology of the hate crime, what do we do inside of a system, inside of a legal system that does not serve us?
So I think, my one frustration in South Africa has always been how politicians speak to, these violences. And I think the queer conversation and the, like, well, I mean, you can't actually divorce sexual gender-based violence and not include queer people. Your feminism has to be inclusive of queer people, right? And I think that's one thing that the total shutdown movement emphasized and did really well when they organized throughout the country. But the one difference between the state and something like the total shutdown movement is that the state is reactionary. They wait for shit to happen, and then they're like, we're going to give harsher sentences. Oh, you're going to get, you're not going to get bail if you perpetuate violence against a woman or a queer person or whatever. But I think there's also the other thing, and this where the conversation goes to what those root causes are, right? In the context of where we live. How does our culture and religion aid gender norms? What do gender roles and gender norms way people out of those roles that you are supposed to fit into? What is this? Being assigned a certain sex at birth versus realizing your gender, and why that is such a contesting thing to so many people. And unpacking things before that. There's so many conversations before that, to understand the diversity of sexuality, the diversity of gender identity, and actually having the conversations with communities, reaching out to leaders and saying, listen, you are someone that is at the helm of being influential here, and you know how to speak to your community. So help us have these conversations, and there's just, now I say training, but I don't say necessarily mean training. So a lot of what we try to do as civil society organizations, sensitization training, but it's also conversations, right? It's giving people deep insight into the humanity, the lived reality, the kinds of violences that are not just overt and physical, but also, the microaggressions that people face, why it needs to change, how this occurs several times in people's days, humanizing the conversation to a degree. And so the conversation also about sensationalism, I've seen it happen so much with queer individuals. We always discuss, do we put down the victim's name, their face, and what has happened to them? And for a lot of us, the conversation is that we are so hushed. The state is so hushed in relation to these murders. It literally feels like we have to consistently have that outcry to get attention, there's so many things in terms of what the long-term race means. Does policy change mean policy change? Does it mean that it's going to impact people's lived reality? How do we monitor that policy change, So I think there's a lot of things that is difficult within that sphere. I mean, when we go protest at court for a victim, we say no bail, harsh sentences, but that's because the sentences have just been null and void. And even if you don't believe in the incarceration system, what are the alternatives to send a message right now, And I think that's what it is. You have to kind of cement yourself so strongly in what is acceptable and not. And I think for queer individuals, that's a consistent fight. When someone misgenders you, you call out your pronoun because it's an urgency of now, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. Yeah. So it's that kind of, you have to feed the symptoms, but you also have to be you work long term towards it. So I think
you have to think radically.
In queer activism, it's always been that way. We're very reactionary to what happens right now, but the work is always continuing on various levels.
Mm-hmm. I'm very conscious about the time and also very conscious about hearing from voices in the audience as well. So I'm going to give you a few moments, because I know there's a lot to chew on, to think about your questions. And in the meantime, as we have a fellow poet on the stage, I would definitely love, if you're open to it, to read some of your poetry while people in the audience kind of think about questions, and then we can kind of taper on. But I hear you, Prof. Do you have something to say?
Yes, just like it's like a very quick point, because I'm glad that Kitumezi and Roche as well have talked about this sensationalism, because I want to share a story. It's a bit of a gruesome story, but it happened while I was sitting in the archives researching the Zulu writer Make Mafuze, who lived between 1840 and 1922. And my intention was to write about a Zulu writer who wrote one book in 1922. And while I was looking through the microfiche copies of Ilanga Lasenatal, I saw a letter in which Make Mafuze described how his daughter was killed by her husband. And this was about around 1910, 1912. And it's a very gruesome story, but the rationale was what shocked me. And the way he describes it, even in Zulu, he said the husband found her smoking a cigarette with another man and literally just cut her up with an axe. And that story made me realize that in South Africa, we actually don't really have a history of femicide. We don't actually know how far back many of these stories go. And I think Kitumetse touched on that point, that we seem to imagine that it's a problem that emerged recently. And as I say in the book, I try to give space to Make Mafuze. I mean, he literally describes himself as a father, as crying for his daughter, and the only place he could publish the story was in the bilingual newspaper of the time. And I've been thinking about that story ever since then. Like, what do you do with something like that from the archives, in which you know that in 1912 a woman was killed just because she smoked a cigarette with another man? Like, how do you take that and historicize it and then connect it to the kind of activist work
And
that Roche
contextualize it.
and Guy Dumezi are doing?
I'm in listening and trying to process and holding space for that story. What I hear also as like a history brain as well, that it's so close to 1913 and the dispossession of black land, and the Native Land Act kind of passing at that point, and how connected are those things. And I think what urgency takes away from us is the ability to think laterally, the ability to think deeply, the ability to think radically, to connect land theft, to connect femicide, to connect patriarchy, to connect what I hear also inside of that, and kinship and what's happening, and what was happening probably by over hundreds of years. So much disruption, colonial violence as well. So there's just so much that I think that in my question and asking about urgency and asking the panel about urgency, I think that I'm very concerned about the moment that we find ourselves in right now. Because what urgency does is it does this thing and thinking, this is happening now, this is only happening now, this has only been happening now, there's only ever been now. And I think with scholars that think about African intellectual history and the history of this violence, of this harm, ask us to do very difficult work, that ask us to unhook ourselves from urgency, even though we are ourselves inside a deeply urgent moment in which so many crises are converging. I mean, our generation is... Our existential dread takes on so many different flavors, because now we're faced with the real destruction of the earth, of the inability to access resources, water, air, such fundamental ways of what it means to be human on the earth. And then now, on top of that, layers of identity, of marginalization, of histories of harm. So thank you so much for bringing that story into the space. Thank you so much. Phew. How are you feeling, Roche, about
okay.
poetry? Are you feeling good?
Yeah.
And our audience, are we thinking about questions? Because I'm going to ask you things. I'm serious. Okay.
Okay, so the interesting thing about me is that like I came out to my parents when I was like 16 years old, right? And then they're like, no, you can't be a lesbian. And then I wasn't. And so, I know, right? So I had internal homophobia for a very long time. And now I realized, you know, that I just don't think I'm going to come out again because it's just like so much work. But the conversation around that is, for me, is constantly interesting because I'm like, when I go home, I'm home, right? And there's certain things that I wouldn't necessarily explore in that space versus outside in the public sphere. But now I'm just hoping that one day, because I keep on sending my family like all the interviews I do and all the radio clips and the TVs, and I hope that they'll realize that I'm not just the ally and I'm like the thing, because I don't think I can be that great of an ally. So this is a poem called Almost 100%, and I suppose it's about knowledge and about queerness and my family. When I was 15, I won the prize for history in my grade. I knew 91% of the history they had taught us, demanded a remark when one paragraph was marked unjustly. In parrot fashion, I recited this history I had been taught, word for word. Elephant memory always did well in Africa. My father was my teacher. He liked history, facts. This became a battle of intellect. But he had spawned an offspring he would seldom understand. My vocabulary was too vast for him, he says. He requests simpler linguistics. Here I wish I spoke only Afrikaans, om meer ernstig voor te kom. But Daddy, we live two different histories. My era permitted singing, I am every woman. Though we were taught that you are the man of the house. My childhood was clad in black. They called me Kaffa Poppy, black, doll, model, then undone, every time you used the word darky. I was Serafina. I only knew songs of freedom. You are happy to just be free from the struggle in this warped democracy. This freedom is enough for you. You hate injustice and yet still vote ANC. You have always said, do not criticize the president too harshly. It could hurt you indefinitely. I loved a girl, loved her. I was young, but I knew that I loved her. In every relationship, I now have to come out. I have to disclose. And in our home, this communication is unsung. This elephant visible under the carpet, but ignored. I wish you had paid witness to me the first year of university when I argued ethics. There too I insisted on a remark of the script and proved to know 92% of an open-ended subject. I have since created my own ethics, Dad. Ethics that differ from yours. You would not listen to my weekly show of LGBTI necessities, but you shed a tear for Good Hope Talks or Cape Talks. How have we lived different histories? Is it because I am a her story? But somehow I know I come from strength. You have come from nothing. You have built us. You have imagined us and made us. Me, my sister, my brother, the greatest gift in one word, siblings. Some of our family still lives in nothing. Some of them always will. By means of your God or mine, you have made a home for our family. We are something. We are not perfect, but we are something. You love our mother. You love us. Here lies story in courtly love. A romantic love. A weekly drove my bicycle over the bridge to visit our mother in her lounge through crime, through poverty kind of love. It is hard to decipher if your love for me is selective. Do you only love the parts of me that reflect you? Do I only love the parts of you that reflects me? Will we ever love collectively, unconditionally? Do you still tell your colleagues the convention? Will you always remain hush on the revolutionary? I wish our histories and ethics could meet at the same space to affirm that we are akin after all. Until then, the rewriting of the story will always happen until there are no longer elephants in the room.
Thank you, Roche. Okay, it's crunch time. Do we have questions? We do. We do have questions. Amazing. They are texted to me through the ether. I'm very happy to be reading them. Beautiful. Okay, great. We have a question from Lindiwe Koza. Appreciating the forge, all the speakers and the moderator and the deep research that went into the theme as reflected by the inputs. Thank you so much. More of a comment than a question. Love that. Love that. Always great. Our second is great discussion from Zama Mtunzi. Great discussion. My question is, what do the panelists think about the government intervention, such as the NSP and the GBV fund? Is that progress that will lead to a better fight against gender-based violence? Prof, what do you think?
Yeah, it's so difficult to talk about the state because, again, in South Africa, we've had different states. And there's much more continuity than divergence from the previous. But again, I want to give you a historical example which shows you how far we've come. So some of you may not know that under customary law, there was no such crime as rape. A black woman living under customary law couldn't be raped. The only thing that could happen to her was something that was called seduction. And the only time that you would hear of such a story is if her father sued the perpetrator. And it was considered to be tort law. So the only compensation was a fine for the perpetrator, and then the alternative of the perpetrator offering to marry the victim. And so in South Africa, we have also a very long history of the state essentially defining black women as non-violable in that sense. And so the point where we are now is actually a point where we can say, at least you have acknowledged that it is possible to violate. Because, I mean, as I say, the state in South Africa spent a long time essentially just saying black women are non-violable because you are the property of your father. So the only person to whom the violence is done is the father. So this was, so I think from that perspective, we need to talk about multiple states rather than just the state. I think that is more close to our reality in South Africa because there are women who've experienced all those transitions to, in those different states that we've had. So if you're a 90-year-old in South Africa, you've lived through various states. You haven't just lived through one. And I think that's a much better lens. But I think the activists would have a much more sort of coal-face example. I just wanted to add that historical one, that I think in South Africa, we're talking about multiple states.
Which is a vital intervention to make.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. I think often when we speak about the state, we speak about the state as a stationary thing, like it never moves. So this is what it is. And, bringing that in is really important to remind us, the same way our responses and our resistance strategies are evolving, so is the state, right? In terms of, do I think that the National Strategic Plan and the GBV Fund are good interventions? Yes. And yes, they are, because they are a culmination of organizations, movements, mobilizing, agitating, just being the fly in the room, basically saying we're not going away. And so what we see, and I mean, historically, we've seen an institutionalizing, a legalizing of state oppression, right? And it's also quite important to see a legalizing and an institutionalizing of state intervention to violence, right? But I do think the strength of both the NSP and the GBVF fund, number one, is in its ability to, permeate into local structures, communities, because I think, like everybody says, South Africa's got an amazing framework of policy, but something happens there, co-implemented, that is eats it up, and that's what we really need to work on. But I also think you know, it also pushes me to think about what is the state, right? What is the state, right? I mean, the state surely can't be what's happening in Cape Town, or, you know, at the Union buildings. I think we are the state. We are dictators of society. And I think it's important that we really promote active citizenship, right? We come from a history where like, guys, apartheid, you couldn't just chill. Like, chilling was like, you know? And now we see that there's almost a passive acceptance of problematic behavior. And what we need to do, the strength of the NSP or the GBVF fund, is in its ability to spark activations, resistance at community level, right? We need to see people speaking about diversity and inclusion at that level. It's all nice when we're speaking on the Forge because we've got the vocabulary, we've got the cloud, you know, but when you're in the community, you know, some of the interventions we have as Black Women Caucus is called Operation Letsaphala, you know, and till today, predominantly Black working class women still do not recognize the violation of rape as something that they can actually go report because it's been normalized. I mean, if the man hasn't seen it as wrong, then who am I to say anything, right? So, you know, yes, we can have the great policy framework, you know, we can have the associated, you know, budgeting, but it must be able to touch the people. It must be able to serve the people. And I think that is the biggest fight as organizations, as civil society organizations, to bring this government to the people, right? Let the people govern, guys. It's that simple.
Sure. Roché?
I think I'm in total agreement with you. I mean, even with our constitution, right? The NSPP is like constitution light. Like, it can be it's a magnificent document. It speaks wonders to what the asks are, but how is this going to be implemented, you know? And that's always my concern. What kind of programs are filtered through to communities? Where is the money going? How is the money spent? You know, just even flagging one of those things like, you know, just reactionary measures. So a lot of the money will, for instance, go to victim support necessary. But I mean, that doesn't mean that you don't have to do preventative work as well, you know. And when we speak about the NSP, there's certain aspects they just don't cover. Like, I mean, education around, for instance, human sexuality, you know, the depth of that, what consent means, and unpacking those kinds of things to then speak to the roots and the root causes of the problems, right? And so I'm always interested. For me, it's great to have the plan and it's great to have the budget. And once you use the budget, I always want a monitoring and evaluation process, you know, like what does this mean in terms of sustainability for gender-based violence? Are we always going to have a NSP plan? Is that the thing in our country now? Is that where we are at? That this needs to be a complete, like a standing document that is going to be implemented for the rest of time. We can't have that, you know. I want a plan to say by some milestones, some action plan needs to happen about when we talk about this mechanism, what's going to happen, how is it going to happen, and what are we trying to achieve, and how do we measure whether it's worked or not. That's what I'm interested in, not just the document. The document doesn't speak to a woman that lives with an abusive husband, who has friends in the police service, you know? But how is that going to speak to that woman?
Can I just, piggyback on that? Resource allocation is extremely political, right? And it's intentional. Who gets the money to do what is really political. And I think it's quite interesting that now we're having the France-Africa kind of dialogues, you know, almost looks like the Africa kind of like having tea with, you know, with the West, and what does that look like?
And what does that mean?
And what does that mean, right? Precisely because we are seeing that the reality is for us to, you know, all these progressive demands that we make require a resourcing, they require a financing. You know, and we don't have that. And although, I mean, like the GBVF fund, seeks to create that financial flow, to ensure that there's thorough implementation of these services and interventions, the reality is that interventions targeted at vulnerable groups are still largely underfunded in comparison to main interventions, right? So even in progressive spaces, patriarchy, guys. And it. But I do think that also we can't also think about these interventions without thinking about the state, and whatever state we are talking about. I mean, our progressive politics must be deliberate and intentional about influencing the state, So when we make demands and say we want a feminist government, what exactly are we saying? Right? Are we saying that we want women in governance? Are we saying that we want how the institutions operate in their very nature? When we speak about decolonizing institutions of higher learning, of course we're intentional about a feminist perspective to that, right? So I think that, number one, we should always be clear about the state as a hotspot for our activism. We must not be afraid to say that Raivatla state. And we want it as a vehicle to really push for progressive governance, to push for equitable distribution of resources, right? And yeah, I just want to close off by really saying that, resource allocation is extremely political. And I think we must be intentional about that conversation. And those who are in France right now should also be, intentional about who's getting this money that is being negotiated, if there is any money
And
that is
why.
And why.
Thank you for that. Do we have any questions from the audience here in our in-person angels that are here as well? Yes.
I'm Carol Podetin-Gono from Valued Citizens Initiative. Sorry, thank you. And it's a comment. I think we need to work together. Advocacy can be you. Programmation can be different organization. We need research. Research is highly expensive for any NGOs. And to track impact, to track where we are going, we need researchers from universities and have access to them for the NGO sector. And I believe it's essential that we don't just connect at events like tonight and other events, but we have regular meeting, not 10 millions, but where we advance particularly, because also we can tap into together, finding resources together, because unity prevails and make power also. And what I believe that if NGOs will learn to work more together, we will advance much more from an advocacy point of view, from programmation, for prevention, because I agree with you, prevention is key. At this time, we deal with at crisis level, and that's why we are pedaling in many, many issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other question? As we wrap up, I'm definitely conscious of the time and don't want to keep people too late. But do we have another question from the floor?
Hi, my name is Shishi Saleh. I'm actually just a private guest coming with a friend. But just my comments from the GBV conversations that have been had today of what I've caught, I just feel like there's a lot of education around defining GBV that needs to happen for prevention to happen. And I think ultimately it's prevention that is what we need. We need to prevent young women finding themselves in situations where they are being not just being murdered but being raped. But I feel like the misinformation or the ignorance is not just, because I think we talk about the rural areas a lot and we talk about women being unable to identify that they have in fact been raped. But just myself, as a young woman, I feel like I struggled
to fully understand and define what GBV was in order to identify that I had possibly been in a risk situation. And I feel like those kind of workshops are so important. If we can get it right with the young girls at at grassroots level, not just in the rural areas, in the urban areas, in the suburbs, I think that's how we definitely would start to alleviate the problem before it becomes a problem. And I think it's that we struggle with. I think we sometimes don't know when what is happening in our romantic relationships is in fact gender-based violence, and we continue and we proceed. We've normalized it as the normal parts of a relationship. We don't see them as red flags. And by the time you are Karabo Mukwena or you are the next, etc., 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 it's too late. So yeah, I think rural and the suburbs, girls really don't know.
Thank you so much for that. I also think that in conversations around gender-based violence, I think sometimes that the language sometimes becomes such a barrier for understanding, and rape culture inside of a deeply patriarchal society as the one that we find ourselves within right now has now kind of positioned gender-based violence as a conversation that should only happen amongst women and femmes, and that overwhelmingly, and we know in this country that perpetrators of violence are men, and that those are the kinds of conversations and educations that need to happen as well, but not even as well, radically, but start from the beginning. So thank you so much for that comment. Do we have another question? Or comment? They're nice, I like them. Okay. I think there's one last one, and it's a comment from Eleanor Sisulu. They say, I have no questions. Would just like to say I attended this webinar out of duty and came away inspired that the future is in good feminist hands. And I think that's a beautiful way to kind of end this conversation. Thank you so much, everyone, for spending time with me, for sharing testimony, for sharing your brilliant minds, incredibly brilliant minds. I'm on fire, I'm geeked out. And thank you so much to our organizers, to our Home the Forge, for just having this conversation and making it possible. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Physically, I know that it's not easy of navigating all kinds of matrices of care and risk and freedom and danger. So thank you so much for sharing space so that we can have these conversations. Thanks. I feel deeply honored.
Thank you to you.
Thanks.